it may be a 6 week, it may be an 8 week block. And as soon as you see that athlete slowing down or not getting any real benefit from that strength stimulus, it might be time to change that stimulus to your 85% of 1RM plus, low volume, plenty of recovery. And again, for me, that's one of the biggest things with strength and power development and speed development is people don't use enough recovery time. I find with hypertrophy, it's very, very individualized. So players will respond very, very differently. So there does tend to be a bit of a toolbox of methods or toolbox of rep ranges and recovery ranges that work for individuals.
Hi there and welcome to the Supporting Champions podcast. Now, my name is Dr. Steve Ingham, performance scientist by trade and training. And in these discussions with performance experts, practitioners and performers, I explore how we deliver performance, how we support others to perform, and the underpinning knowledge and concepts at play. I really hope you enjoy the conversations from today's episode or from the back catalogue. And if you do, it'd be great if you can take a chance to like and subscribe to the channel, or for the audio, take a moment to leave a review. It really helps the show. Right, let's get into the discussion. Welcome to the Supporting Champions podcast. Now today I'm joined by Professor Liam Kilduff from Swansea University, an expert in performance science. And in this conversation, we explore the insights from Liam's applied research, in particular around his expertise on effective methods for measuring and developing speed and power in athletes, emphasizing the foundational role of strength training before progressing to the power. We discussed the critical role of recovery in optimizing athletic performance, exploring advanced strategies like post-activation potentiation. Liam highlights how maintaining muscle temperature is key to maximizing power output and preventing injuries. Through our discussion, we touch on the significance of tailoring recovery strategies and training methods to individual athletes, utilizing the data-driven approach to refining performance and preparation. The key things you're going to take away from this conversation: the integration of strength and power training for building athletic performance, the benefits of individualizing recovery times and methods of enhancing performance, the impact of muscle temperature on performance and how passive heating can aid recovery, and the evolving role of sports science in developing data strategies that support personalized training and competition preparation. Let's get into the conversation. Welcome, Liam. How are you?
Very good, Steve. Yeah, very good. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Now, looking through your research profile, there's such a big, strong trend of rugby power. Is that your background? Have you got power, speed-based rugby background as an athlete?
Yeah, I probably claim that I've failed at most sports, but most sports have been strength and power based. Younger days, I was a boxer. Then went more into team sports, traditional Irish sports like Gaelic football. Then into soccer, and then kind of later in my career, it was not till about 2021 when I went to Australia that I get into my rugby league initially, then rugby union, and then obviously throughout my PhD and my academic career, focus very heavily in rugby research, international and professional teams.
Yeah, okay. So you've got that, at least that understanding and empathy, and sometimes it helps, doesn't it? But sometimes it doesn't. I've worked in middle distance sports for my whole life, but I don't have a middle distance background. But it sometimes helps, doesn't it? Just understand the demands or the intricacies of working with players in that field.
Yeah, 100%. I personally think it's key. And not that you've necessarily played the sport, but that appreciation for the athletes going through, specifically in their sport, but also in the wider context of life, and realizing that what you're doing with them, whether it's as a consultant or as a member of their staff, that you're appreciative of that what you're doing is important, but there's a much wider context to it as well. And I think as soon as you show that and understand that and appreciate that, I think you get much better buy-in from the players, because then they really appreciate that you're in there to do a job, and therefore they appreciate that yes, it's only a small part of their preparation, but it could be quite a large part of your job and your research, and you get that real kind of mutual respect and buy-in, and I think that's really, really important going forward.
So you've got quite an applied research background. Just looking through the list here, soccer, rugby, estimating force and power, rugby, back squats. It's unusual these days. And this is quite a nuanced question, but it's unusual these days, certainly in the UK, to see such a strong applied research profile. Typically, it's clinical, occasional indulgence in a side PhD to do some sports performance stuff. How have you been able to manage that?
I think it's a really good question. And it's that question of your traditional sport and exercise science research, your lab-based research, your more mechanistic-based research versus your applied research. I personally believe both are equally important. Both should coexist. Both should complement each other. But me personally, I've been lucky. I will be lucky. Say that I'm lucky. I've developed some amazing collaborators, people I've worked with for well over 20 years. So, sports and individuals. Swansea University has allowed me to kind of forge my way in that career and stay true to that, what I've been passionate about. As I said, the clinical area is really important, but it's not something I'm passionate about. And I do believe if you're going to have a long-term career, really enjoy what you do, you have to be passionate about it. And I think, again, the applied research that we do, it's still, for want of a better term, ticks all the academic boxes. We still bring in significant research income. We still have a lot of really high quality PhD students helping us drive this research and producing some very, very good outputs. But I think the other thing that's changed in the last probably 10 years, as you know, Steve, is the whole emphasis on impact. And the fact that universities really now understand the importance of impact, the importance of working with industry and making sure that your research or a component or elements of your research are having an impact beyond academia. And I think that's really allowed to refocus for certain individuals. As you said, I've never really deviated from it, but it certainly has allowed a number of academics to refocus on what sports science was first developed for. We're an applied discipline. Yeah. And that ability to go back and really engage with our end users and help them shape our research. One thing I'm very proud of, I think I wouldn't know the exact numbers, but if I went through all my papers that I've produced, I'd be amazed if it wasn't well over 90% of those papers have a practitioner or an applied individual on them, because we always co-develop or research question. And I think that's absolutely key to making sure it's impactful for the practitioner and for the academic involved.
No, without wanting to blow smoke up your lifting trousers, there's only a few people that I think of immediately when I think of applied impact for research excellence, having provided sort of supporting statements over the years or sat on that impact or the ref panel. That I think of people like yourself. So congrats to that. Look, let's get into the subject if we can. I'd love to talk to you about at least three things and maybe some tangents along the way on this theme of speed and power development, how you train it, how you get it ready for competition or potentially preserve also that during competition. And maybe we start off with kind of speed and power, how we measure it. If you're thinking about working with athletic performers or team players, what are the sort of ways in which you'd capture that as a quality?
There's a variety of different ways, as you know. Traditionally, very much utilizing force platforms. So that's all, originally it was probably 15, 20 years ago, we started using our isometric mid-thigh pulls to look at peak force and to look at rates of force development and force at various different time frames along that force time curve. Looking at things, counter movement jumps, squat jumps, drop jumps. And now with the advancement technologies, we're able to do that, using sprint 1080s and stuff of that nature. We're able to look at a more horizontal plane and vertical plane and stuff of that nature. So, but I never really deviate too far away from our force platforms and the way we can do a fairly good strength and power diagnostics of our athletes, looking at specific qualities that we know are important that underpins KPIs in sport. Over the years, we've developed some good, should we say, standards or areas where we would like to see athletes, or values where we'd like to see athletes close to for specific sports, in particular rugby. And that's where we tend to focus, that kind of force and power diagnostics. And then there's a range of different tools, all with their strengths and weaknesses, that are out there to be utilized by the practitioner and the researcher.
Can you give me a few of those examples of the sorts of specifics, you mentioned a few of the metrics. What would the sort of qualities, if you're taking an elite rugby team through a set of protocols, obviously differences between positional play and so on, what were the sort of numbers you're talking about or benchmarking with?
So it depends from a maximum strength perspective. And again, these are all specific to our standards, the way we collect that data. But we'd want to see people being able to produce over 4,500 newtons on an isometric mid-thigh pull, specific to obviously positional setup and all that sort of stuff. And we've got standards for some of our back three players where we'd like to be producing well over 55 watts per kg on a counter movement jump in terms of relative power. We like to see them at RSIs in the back three, that well over 3.5, arbitrary units for that. So we've got different values for different positions, different levels, and again, all generated off or methods. And I think that's one of the things where people get a little bit confused, or there's lots of different tweaks to different methods in terms of how you collect that data. We're always very, very standardized in the way we do it for our athletes. So every time, I would like to say we've tested well over 1,000 professional rugby players. So every time we go out and test, we use the exact same procedures, exact same equipment, exact same filtering methods, etc. So we've came up with our standards based on that. Those numbers may seem a little high or a little low to individuals, but I would always say take them in context in terms of the equipment used to collect them, the data procedures used to collect them, and stuff of that nature.
Yeah, fair enough. And in terms of then developing training for speed and power, give us any background philosophical approach to this, but how do you start developing that for an elite player?
It's a great question. I think the first thing you always do for me is look at their strength level, initial strength level. Even before you worry about power, have they got a sufficient level of strength? Because there's some really good work done by Prue Cormier a number of years ago, I think it was 2010, showing clearly that if you've got, should we say, a weaker individual, again, how you define that is open for conversation. If you develop their strength level, you'll actually develop their power output as well. So straight away, you will get an improvement in power output if you get them stronger, for want of a better term. And the second one that she clearly showed from her research was that the stronger the athlete is, the better they adapt to power training. So again, straight away, I'll always go back. Again, we've got a very simple kind of needs analysis when it comes to looking at athletes. The first thing we'll always do is look at strength level. Do they have a sufficient level of strength? If they haven't, won't worry about power training at all, go straight into developing their strength. If they have, that's where they come into this strength and power diagnostics, where we do a range of tests to try and figure out what the best method is to use, or what's the best variable within that kind of strength and power continuum to look at, whether it's lower body power, whether it's reactivity, whatever the variable could be. And we try and use this battery of tests to identify where I wouldn't say weaknesses, but where we're going to get the best development.
Okay, so are you taking strength based off the kind of raw numbers of force in isometric terms? Or
not always. Yeah, okay. Usually yes.
What else are you adding?
You can use things like your back, 3RM, your deadlift, whatever traditional lifts that sport would use. If they've got really good historical data, we can look at that as well. But if we're going in ourselves to test, we will look at holistically all the different variables they've got, but we will tend to go off our isometric mid-thigh pull data.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. And so, is that then looking at the functional ability to be able to execute some strength-based training too? Isometric mid-thigh pull is one action, but can you safely perform a squat, deadlift? The essentials to be able to entrain the movements. But are you tending to sort of go towards sort of form and stability first before you start developing the strength?
Again, you would always do that, but I'm quite lucky in the fact the level of athlete I work with, and the level of practitioners that are within those sports. I wouldn't say taken as a given. They're always, very good form. If they have any, injury history, those exercises would have been adapted over the years anyway. So you might get a group of athletes who just don't squat for whatever reason. They'll then obviously, trap bar deadlift or something of that nature. So a lot of that has already been done for us in terms of how we would program going forward. And again, we would give advice and direction of what needs to be developed. I'm not a practitioner. The practitioners will then take that forward in a 4, 6, and 8 week block of training, whatever that would look like. We would give them the direction and certainly have a really good conversation with them around it, but the specifics of exercise selection would a lot of time come down to the practitioners, the environment, and their knowledge of the player.
Yeah, okay. So you're then looking for some benchmarks for people to reach a certain level of strength before you then start to phase in power-based training. Is that what I'm sensing for you?
Yes and no. You can have a threshold, you can have an idea in mind, but a lot of the time what we'll do and what we'll suggest is if we think it's a weakness, or if we think there's an area for improvement, we'll ask them to go into a block of training and might have an undefined endpoint, which sounds a bit strange. But as soon as that player stops developing, that might be the time to shift them into another phase. So instead of this classical approach of 4 weeks, 4 weeks, 4 weeks, 4 weeks hypertrophy, 4 weeks strength, 4 weeks power, or whatever the mix be, I do like the idea of if you think strength is the correct focus, it may be a 6 week, it may be an 8 week block. And as soon as you see that athlete slowing down or not getting any real benefit from that strength stimulus, it might be time to change that stimulus. And one way of changing that would be sticking them into a power phase or something of that nature.
Yeah.
That's the way. It's like a proactive way of programming, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, I like that. And it makes more sense, doesn't it, rather than sitting with structures and stiff, or just because I've written down a periodized plan, just because my Excel spreadsheet is formatted in a way that means that it's 4 week blocks. Respond to the data, respond to the information. If they're running out of steam here, or you try to give it a couple of weeks to try and move it on. If they're not responding, then switch up the stimulus.
100%. Yeah. And that can be just, changing the emphasis. That can be changing the exercises. There's a number of different ways of doing that. And again, in the wider context of if they're in season, out of season, all these sorts of things going on as well, all the different types of training they're doing. But yeah, I do think that method is it's common sense. It's hard in a team environment. We've got 50 players and you're trying to have them all changing at different times potentially. But again, it's something, as you said, I don't like the whole idea of being very fixed and rigid. I do think it's you use the numbers to guide your decisions, and you have a template, you have an idea, and then as it goes along, you may change or you may stick with it. It could be working out perfectly to plan, which is very rare, but it can happen. But yeah, you're being more proactive with your planning.
So just fill in the gaps here for me. So if you've got a player that's not strong enough, their force generating capabilities and just not high enough, let's say for example in a squat or a deadlift, your focus then is simply to get the force abilities up. Are you looking at specific hypertrophy goals, or are you just thinking actually if you can generate the force, you can generate the force? But the priority there is actually, we're not going velocity yet. We're not improving the speed of the rate of force development. You're just high force, low velocity, and just start progressing that force generating capability.
Yeah, very much. Especially, you always try and get them to move it as fast as they can in a safe environment. So that intention to move quickly should always be there. But the primary emphasis, as you said, is that force component. So you're 85% of 1RM plus, low volume, plenty of recovery. And again, for me, that's one of the biggest things with strength and power development and speed development is people don't use enough recovery time. This, a lot of practitioners and even a lot of researchers, when you look at the research, we seem uncomfortable with giving athletes 4 or 5 minutes to recover. We seem to like to hover around 1.5, 2 minutes before we get them back into something. I do think that's something that to really develop high levels of power, speed, and strength, you really need to be tight on that recovery element. Under basic physiology would make sense you do that, but just in applied environment, and as I said, a research environment, researchers we're equally to blame here, or equally at whatever. We're not as stringent as we maybe should be on the recovery elements of it. But you're right. But also going back to what we said, we started with strength. But you're right, again, hypertrophy for me a lot of time comes before that. And if we believe that it's the increased cross-sectional area of muscle fibers that are a limiting factor of them developing strength, you might put a hypertrophy phase in prior to that as well. On the same basis that as soon as they stop benefiting from that hypertrophy program, it may be the time then to try and switch it into a strength phase.
Right, a couple of things there that I might come back to. Recovery. I'll come back to recovery because that's really interesting. And certainly from a applied perspective of thinking, what do athletes actually do versus the published literature, which are set protocols which people think they need to mimic to try and replicate gains. Hypertrophy first, potentially. And is your tendency or your advice there quite open to the approach to generate that hypertrophy? I'm just conscious, having had Brad Schoenfeld on the podcast last year, and we were talking about higher reps generating hypertrophy at the same sort of level as your classic 8 to 10 reps to failure. Are you quite open to that? Or if your goal is more speed and power, do you tend to keep the rep number lower?
I find with hypertrophy, it's very, very individualized. So players will respond very, very differently. So there does tend to be a bit of a toolbox of methods or toolbox of rep ranges and recovery ranges that work for individuals. I do tend to like the slightly lower reps, higher, especially because you're talking about most sports, it's about being able to produce high amounts of force in relatively short time frames, so not deviate too much from that. But you will get a group of athletes who just won't respond to that, and ultimately you want that increased cross section. So therefore you may go to the higher, longer rep ranges if required, if you're not getting your athlete to, if the athlete's not responding to that initially, should we say, lower rep range of 8 to 10 reps type stuff, 60-65%.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, interesting. I mean, it's just opens up the possibilities, doesn't it? But as you say, that simple question of, are you responding? Well, if not, let's not necessarily just go with a traditional, perhaps, effective, but somewhat dogmatic or old-fashioned way of approaching it with 10 reps to failure, for example. Yeah, interesting. And then recovery, you mentioned like kind of 4 to 5 minutes. I mean, certainly, you often need to be a professional athlete to be able to accommodate that. Sometimes you haven't got enough time to do it. But one of the things that I noticed starting to work with sprinters, power athletes over the years was just how much they naturally take to recover between all-out efforts, and how that becomes actually really long when it comes into the taper of being comfortable to go 4, 5 minutes, 8 minutes, 12 minutes, 20, 25 minutes for all-out pre-competition performance. And then you're actually in a position of thinking, do I need to warm up for this? Because there's so much time again between that. And what's your sort of observation of working with elite performers that to try and get the best out of them, using that recovery in an artful way to generate that power?
Again, there's quite a bit in that. Normally, if we're talking about strength training, speed training, we'll always emphasize that 4 to 5 minute, that PCR resynthesis type kind of equation. If it's sprinting, I use a general rule of 1 minute per 10 meter sprint. So if they've done a 20, 30, 40 meter sprint, it's 2, 3, 4 minutes recovery. When you're talking about more all-out events as part of the kind of final phase, what we have done in the past with certain sports is, especially if they're going to that 10 to 12 minute recovery time in between attempts or in between repetitions, whatever you want to call them, we will start thinking about implementing some passive heating methods as well. So therefore they will do an all-out sprint over 60, 70 meters. They might want 6, 7, 8 minutes recovery. We will start to wrap them up to try and keep them warm in between those repeated efforts, to try and A, allow them to recover, really important, but B, to try and make sure their muscle temperature is at a really good level. So each subsequent sprint is at as near maximum or as maximum as it can be. So there's a few different ways of tweaking or combining a few different methods to try and get the benefits of an elongated recovery period, but B, making sure it's not being compromised by a decrease in muscle temperature or some other, should we say, negative element to it.
This episode of Supporting Champions podcast is sponsored by Athlete Now, the perfect platform for sports practitioners looking to expand their reach. Whether you're a sports scientist, therapist, or coach, Athlete Now helps you showcase your expertise, connect you directly with athletes, and grow your business. With no ads, no commissions, and access to industry discounts, is designed to make your services stand out. Join as a practitioner today to get listed, promote your services, and connect with athletes who need your support. And for athletes, it's free to sign up, giving you access to exclusive discount deals and direct connections with the best in the industry. Visit theathletenow.com to find out more. That's interesting. Then maybe we'll come back to muscle warming, passive heating, warming trousers, and so on in a moment then. And so then if I can just take this sort of case on, so you've done a hypertrophy phase, you've done some strength-based development, and then when you're starting to enter into the power phase, have you got some sort of specifications about the percentage of 1 RM or the speed of movement that you'd be looking for from players?
Not necessarily when it comes to, because there's so many different methods of developing power, ranging from training at the optimum load for certain exercises through your exercise selection, whether you're looking at Olympic lifts versus performing movements more ballistically. You've obviously got plyometrics. You've got the ability to utilize PAP, so in terms of your more complex contrast type training. You've got the ability to use cluster reps. where you've got a set of 6 and you're taking a recovery in between every 2. So there's such a variety of different methods of developing power that the kind of rep range, the intensity, the recovery, all that kind of is very much dictated by how, what method you're using to develop power.
Yeah, okay. And some broad guidelines in terms of the percentages of 1RMs that you have in mind?
It can range from body weight up to 85-90%. So usually it looks like with kind of lower body, kind of squat, jump, stuff of that nature, body weight is the optimum load, for want of a better term, to produce the higher levels of power. When you go more down to your Olympic lift and derivatives, you're more the 85-90% of your 1RM.
Okay. So now what's the sort of universality of this, or how you mentioned about some fundamental research. Basically, if you get strong, you develop your power. If we're thinking about the sort of force velocity curve, which sort of follows that exponential tail off, that the higher forces you generate, the slower the velocity, and vice versa. As long as you're sort of tickling each area, as long as you're working each area, you're likely to be getting a shift in that force velocity ability, and/or is the value in training across the spectrum of velocity movements?
I think certainly it depends on your sport, but I do believe there is value of training across your force velocity curve, and how you do that. Whether you start more at the velocity end, you start more force end with maybe your Olympic lifting, and then as you're coming closer to competition, you're focusing much more on the velocity end. I think there's a variety of different ways of doing it, but I do like working across the force velocity curve, and I do like going from a strength phase into something that's still quite high force, but obviously a greater emphasis on velocity, whether that's Olympic lifting or whether that's some sort of PAP type exercise where you've got that kind of heavy load followed by a dynamic element to it. And then closer it's coming to competition, making it as more velocity specific to competition as possible, but also starting to decrease that kind of very heavy force component out of that kind of training load equation. I think makes common sense to me, and it's what athletes tend to like. But yeah, I do go back to this whole force velocity curve and trying to hit a significant proportion of that into your kind of final power training phase, taper into the competition.
Yeah, okay. So it's some broad principles there, but very open. I certainly like that approach, do a bit of everything all the time. That means that perhaps you might not be doing some of the super sharp speed-based work early in your training season, for example, during the winter months, but you might do it every now and again, just to keep that fresh and just to keep the variety up, and also just to make sure that it's not too alien when it comes to the competition season.
And it's also a good check of progress, isn't it? Is how are you progressing? Yeah. You've got a long-term aim, a long-term goal of where you'd want to get to. And if you're having that check, whether that's testing or whether that's in training assessment, whatever term you want to use, I think it's a nice, to have something very, very specific where you really know that is the end point. That is a mark that if you're on track, you're going to be in a really good shape when it comes to competition time. I think, it makes perfect sense to have that in at different intervals.
Yeah. Okay, so getting ready for competition then. I mean, you sort of hinted to actually some ideas around developing real velocity-based approach for maybe in the taper, but I'm really interested to sort of tap into your expertise around the two elements around post-activation potentiation and muscle warming. And let's start with PAP, or post-activation potentiation, first of all. Could you sort of, just for those who aren't familiar with it, just sort of take us through what it is? I mean, for those who are thinking, I think I've heard of that, they probably heard it back from the 80s, didn't they? We're sort of famous for East German, Soviet athletes using it pre-sprinting. But could you just give us a bit of a heads up as to what it is?
Yeah, so a kind of classical definition is an acute enhancement of muscle functioning following like a preload stimulus or following a PAP stimulus. Practically what that looks like is you would normally have something, and there's lots of varieties, you would normally have something quite heavy. So as we discussed, more like a strength stimulus. So maybe something around 3 to 4 repetitions at about 85% of 1RM. Maybe a single set, maybe multiple sets. Again, there can be contrast complex. It is a certain time frame, which again is pretty important. And then you perform something that is more on the explosive end of that spec. Biomechanically similar, obviously. So example might be a squat, heavy squat, weighted time frame, do a counter movement jump or a sprint. And the whole idea being that preload stimulus or that force stimulus has changed something in the muscles kind of contractile history that allows it to produce more power than it would if that wasn't there.
Okay, so some lifting that primes the system, but you provide it with enough rest, and then when you restart for perhaps competition, you produce more, you're more effective. Yeah. And so I'm interested to know how individualized that is. And we've sort of touched on this as a topic, but where we've talked about, what works for you, what works for one person doesn't work for another. Are there some limits, or is it a variety of different approaches? Do you go heavy? Do you have to have a heavy stimulus to get the effect? Or do you have to test this with individuals so that you know what works for them? I mean, I suppose there's two aspects of this. The loading you use, but also the time frame. When's best to perform after that?
Yeah. Okay, a couple of things. So the first thing for me is, again, it goes back to that you don't go into power training unless you're confident that they've got a really strong strength base. I would say the exact same thing with power.
So it's not the sort of thing you'd use for strength-based or power-based training naive players.
Exactly. I would go back to the whole thing is there is a again, I won't give specifics, but there is a strength level that if you don't have that strength level, your best direction is very much strength training. A chance of you being able to harness and utilize PAP if you're a relatively weak athlete is slim based on some of the research out there. Right. There's a strong relationship between strength levels and ability to harness PAP or utilize PAP. Going on to your recovery time, that is very individualized. We've done a bit of work in it a long time ago now, where we showed that on average 8 minutes was about the right time, but with a lot of individual variation. I think from memory, about 60% of our athletes, 8 minutes was the best time for them, and at about 20% either side of that. So 20% at 12 minutes, 20% at 4 minutes. We only did it in 4-minute intervals. So it might be a little bit more granular than that, but we just did it in 4-minute intervals. So if I was to hang my hat on a time frame with a group of athletes, I would go 8 minutes. But you're right in saying that it would be much better if you could do it individualized. Again, not always the most practical thing, but if you want to really make sure it's A, working for them, and B, you've got the best time frame or the most optimum time frame, it should be done individualized. When it comes to loading, again, depending on the mode of exercise, so there's a lot of modulating factors. So one you mentioned there was the intensity, but also the conditioning type or the muscle action, whether it's isometric, whether it's a traditional isotonic, whether it's a ballistic, will dictate the intensity to a certain degree. Most classical research with regard to PAP in training environments and non-competition environments will use the high load, but obviously that's not the most practical when it comes to if you want to utilize it, as you said, as a competition day strategy. It based on that 8-minute time frame, or give or take 8-minute time frame. It's not always practical to have 240, 250, 260 kilos in some cases by pitch side or by track side. So therefore then you could look at your isometrics. Again, you can induce PAP with isometrics. I'm aware of British Cycling doing some nice work where they just lock the crank on the bike at certain angles, push against it for 3-4 seconds as a way of inducing PAP. And also you can induce it ballistically, so dropping down that intensity spectrum but performing it much more dynamically, whether that's like resisted sprints, resisted jumps or something of that nature. So there are a few different ways of tweaking how you induce PAP, probably very much based on the environment you're in and access to equipment and rules and regulations around sports. So you have got a few different methods you can utilize. But I think you touched on it, and again, I completely agree. You would always make sure that all this sort of stuff is trialed in training environments, in non-competition environments. So when you go to competition, the athlete is very, very comfortable with what you're asking them to do, and also that you're confident it's going to work, because competition day is a very, as you know better than I do, very stressful environment, very, whatever. So their default has to be going back to what they're comfortable with, what they've trialed with, and what they know works for them.
Yeah, that's interesting. And so there's a trade-off potentially around practicality and certainty that you might be able to do this versus effectiveness. So it's an isometric version, which probably is high practicality. Is that slightly lower in terms of its effectiveness than, say, a dynamic or maximal force generating capability exercise? Is that the isometric versions lower grade?
I don't think so. Again, no one specifically looked at that.
Oh, right.
No one specifically looked at isometric versus an isotonic. We've looked at a traditional 85% versus a ballistic. and we found a 1% difference. So to me, negligible, no difference at all really in terms of their effectiveness. I couldn't see really a rationale or reason why isometric wouldn't be as effective. Again, I always go back to mechanisms. So if what you're utilizing, will that hit the correct mechanisms? So whether that's enhanced recruitment of type 2 muscle fibers, whether that's an increase in muscle temperature, whether that's an increase in hormones, whatever the proposed mechanism is. And I couldn't see why an isometric wouldn't hit those mechanisms and therefore wouldn't lead to a PAP, being able to induce PAP. And I couldn't see a rationale why they would be less effective or even more effective than other methods.
Yeah, interesting. So, I mean, I'm sort of copying and pasting and comparing with the sort of competition plan strategies that I would put together for an athlete. And when we're putting together almost like an oxygen uptake kinetics priming warm-up for a middle distance athlete, we might want them to do a 200-300 meter rep, but they might get to a competition and they might not be able to do a rep of that duration comfortably. It might only be they've got a 120 meter warm-up track, and so we might have to have a high quality backup, which might mean 60 meters turnaround, 60 meters turnaround. And so this idea of kind of creating practical but effective solutions, if you get to an away game, or if you get to a competition and you haven't got the facilities you thought you were going to, and you can't get the stuff you want into that environment, you've got backups there. So what would a Heath Robertson version of an isometric PAP-based priming session for a group of rugby players with no facilities look like? How would you do that?
It depends player position. So if you're talking about props, you might do a 1v2 scrum. So one player versus 2 or 3. So therefore straight away you unless that's an unbelievably good one player versus 3 not very good, you would hope there'll be a small bit of movement, not a huge amount. You can obviously utilize other players in sprint positions where they're pushing, holding. You've got walls, you've got a variety of different methods, you've got goal posts. It's just about, and I like that idea. What I always say to the athletes is, we're going to give you a toolbox of options, ones that we're confident work. Maybe, as you said, one might be slightly more effective than the other, but ultimately it's a toolbox of options. And then when you roll into your environment and your X isn't there, your bike isn't there, or your X is, whatever you would like to use isn't there, you've got another method, another option. And therefore your athletes don't get flustered, they don't panic. So yeah, there's a variety of different ways. You're only limited by your imagination, as I say, in terms of being able to induce PAP through, well, actually not just isometric, even through ballistic activities. There's a variety of different things. You can use players, you can use balls, you can use bands, you can use lots of different ways of inducing PAP.
Yeah, and I love it from a psychology point of view as well, especially if you're preempting it and you're testing it and you're trialing it. Potentially that you're upgrading some of the warm-ups for play or for training generally by saying, right, we're going to use this today to get you in a great state of mind and state of physical preparation for training. But we're trialing a different version that means that if you get to that competition, your backup is going to be great. Yeah. We know it's going to be effective. And psychologically, you might be constrained by the environment, but your competitors are probably going to be constrained by the environment. And if you've got a great backup, then you're in a great position. I love that kind of approach, really, for that pre-planning.
Yeah, and I think it's really important because I have seen instances where people make such a big thing of a method in a specific way. They build it up that this is the mecca. You need to do it this way. It's so important to do it this way. And exactly that, you roll into your environment and something has changed and you can't do it. And you can see players just lose the confidence or whatever else. You always have to have I always go back to the term toolbox. You always have to have a toolbox of options and the athlete takes ownership on that. It's the same as morning priming, where we've done a lot of work around morning priming as a match day strategy, and we have 5 or 6 different protocols that we're confident works, and we let athletes on the day of competition pick which one they want to work. Most of them are kind of, should we say, again, resistance training based, but if an athlete wakes up and they're a little bit stiff, they don't just feel like doing a kind of mini strength session in the morning competition, we say no problems, do an off feet session, do an upper body session, do this session. So again, it is very much giving the athlete the ownership and the responsibility, because they're the ones performing, not me. They're the ones who know. We can monitor, we can ask them specific questions, take measures on the day of competition, but ultimately they know how they feel. And by giving them options, giving them toolbox, I think that gives them that ownership and that buy-in and that direction, which I think is ultimately important for the athlete.
Yeah. And just curious to know, and maybe this sort of weaves into the approach around keeping your muscles warm. You do your warm up, you get cold, you go out onto the pitch, you've done this amazing set and warm up, and maybe the game gets delayed or the competition gets delayed by a few minutes, and so the timing that you'd set things up for with post activation potentiation or muscle warming perhaps could come into play there. Is it potentially, I mean, I don't know if you've looked at this, but you do your ideal warm-up, and if you get a delay, you've got some sort of smaller, sharper priming that keeps things alive, if you like, before the actual game starts. Have you got those sorts of approaches too, where there's almost like a little reminder protocol?
Yeah, and again, they're pretty ingrained with the players, so they know if there's anything more than a 5-minute delay, they should go and just stay. Initially, the initialing is just stay moving. Grab a ball, do some very simple walk through low intensity drills. If the delay becomes longer, you'll then find that you'll see the conditioners coming onto the pitch, and they will then start to drive what that looks like. And it tends to be just a little bit more intense, a little bit more movement, a little bit more game specifics, getting up to game specific speed, depend on the length of the delay. So yeah, there are different protocols out there. It's like re-warming up your substitutes. You know, you've got your subs on it, and every 15 to 20 minutes you send them out to re-warm up, just so whenever they are called upon, they're ready to go onto the pitch. It's the exact same if you have a delay. You have to have protocols in place. It has to be, I think, driven by the players initially, because again, they're going to know. And then if the delay is a little bit longer than you'd like, then as a practitioner or as a whatever, you get involved and drive it and shape it as you need to.
Yeah, and so muscle warming. I mean, I think originally they came from the idea of motorcycling trousers, didn't they? So motorcyclists and sitting on bikes, getting freezing cold. So you've got these thermal conductors in the seams of the trousers to keep people warm. Just talk us through the thinking there, the physiology. I mean, the obvious thing is that there's a muscle temperature drop, but why is it so important to keep that muscle temperature high?
Good question. So again, there's some really good work, I think it was in the early 80s, might even looking at the relationship between muscle temperature and power output. So back then they were suggesting that for every 1 degree increase in muscle temperature, you had anywhere between a 4 and 12% improvement in power output. That big range
That's a lot, isn't it?
It is. And that big range is very much due to contraction velocity and how you're measuring it. But you know, if you think of it, a warm-up in most sports, when you look at literature and applied practice, you're only aiming for around a 3 degree increase in muscle temperature. So you're anywhere between a 12 and 36% change in power. I think it's closer to 12 in the stuff we do when we look at counter movement jumps. I think that's around that ballpark. So again, from a practical perspective, when I go into sports and if I'm looking at what they do in a warm-up, I will get players to do a jump before they warm up, a jump after they warm up, and look at what change in power up. And if it's around the 12%, I tend to be fairly comfortable. If it's below 12%, and in a lot of cases it's significantly below 12%, it gives you that focus, right? We need to look at the composition of warm up and if there's any heat loss windows, etc., etc. But yeah, so there's a very strong relationship between muscle temperature and power output going up, but equally coming down. So as soon as you start dropping muscle temperature, you start to lose power output. And we've spent the initial, 15, 20 minutes of this podcast talking about power output. Power output's fundamental to performance across all sports, in my view, not just power-based sports, every sport. And therefore trying to keep that muscle temperature as high as possible for, in particular, start competition, because once you start competition, that's probably been looked after itself, you know, through movement, through everything else. But also equally from an injury prevention perspective, making sure that they start competition with a nice high muscle temperature, so less susceptible to injury. And a lot of injuries in team sports tend to happen at the start of games, at the start of the second half, where there's a potential heat loss window of 10 to 15 minutes. So yeah, there's a strong relationship between temperature and power output, and therefore trying to maintain or elevate that temperature or that muscle temperature when there's been a heat loss window is really, really important.
And so, is that your recommendation for? Yeah, I mean, I agree that, you know, powers are important for a lot of sports, but certainly for the power-oriented sports, is that your recommendation that players should be wearing heating garments or sufficiently thick thermal kit so that there's a reduction in the heat loss following the warm-up?
Yeah, very much so. We try and implement that as much as we can. Starting with, obviously, I think you were involved in back in the day when we were starting to play with the Blizzard heat jackets, those foil jackets. They were quite effective, to be fair to them, but not necessarily the best thing to be, you know, standing in front of 80, 90,000 people. God knows how many people watching TV wrapped in a foil jacket. But definitely we try it. But as you said, then people have gone on to look at heated trousers with wire heaters. Again, some way effective. And up to a stage now where people are looking at even new technologies, utilising graphene and producing heated panels that can be controlled and monitored. KSI are doing some lovely work in this space, trying to get a heated garment which is based out of graphene, which is very flexible, moldable, very low energy source, so you don't need huge batteries to keep it heated. Very uniform heat distribution, and literally can be shaped, made to whatever size and fit. So it could be literally a quad panel, a glute panel, a chest panel, a back panel. So and they're much more user friendly, for want of a better term, for those kind of gaps between, say, when you finish your warm up, when you start your competition. When you're talking about substitutes and half time, it's probably easier just to wrap them in anything you need. Whether it's a blizzard heat because they're sitting down on a bench or in the change room, it's probably easier to just wrap them in whatever you need to wrap them that has good thermal properties and will do the job. But this space is evolving quite quickly, and I think you're going to see some new technologies coming out soon, or hopefully soon, that will really square away these heat loss windows and the ability to close them off.
Yeah, okay, interesting. I do wonder about substitutes. You see people in a big jacket but nothing on their legs, for example. And I wonder just how the commonality, how accepted these sorts of ideas are, but also how persuasive practitioners are in terms of their sell for this, where someone might need to be sitting, waiting to be substitute for maybe 60 minutes or so prior to a football game, or actually maybe trying to think intuitively about, well, you might not need to stay warm for the first half as a substitute, but you might come on in the second half, and therefore there's a warm-up protocol at half-time, and then there's warming garments that get people in the right position, irrespective of whether they come on or not.
Yeah, again, it goes back to what we said before. You trial it, you get athlete buy-in outside the competition environment. Time of year can dictate it very much. If you're in the middle of winter, there's very few players who refuse to wear something nice and warm. They're all mad to be wrapped up in something that's nice and warm when they're sitting on the bench. But again, I've never found it too hard to get athlete buy-in, because you trial it, you explain it to them, you let them ask questions. We've had some scenarios where, and I won't give the specific scenarios, where players have looked potentially quite silly in what they've been wrapped up in major tournaments, and they've been happy to do that because they were so confident it was giving them a performance edge. So I think it's all depends on your interactions with the players and the environment you give them to ask questions, challenge you, trial it, give feedback. As you said, some of them, if you're using a garment that wraps their whole body, someone will say, I'm feeling too warm around my head and my chest. You go, absolutely fine, great feedback. Let's just wrap around the key musculature you're going to use, which in a lot of cases tends to be lower body. So yeah, I think it's all how you introduce and engage your athletes with any of these technologies. But we've never had an issue. Athletes are usually superb and give us some brilliant feedback and allow us to get to an end point where the protocol is much more better than what I would have designed myself.
Yeah. Which begs the question whether it's even being raised, because if it's so tangible, it's so easy to implement, it might actually offer some comfort on the bench, whether it's actually being used. Fascinating stuff, Liam. Appreciate you walking us through your expertise and the practical aspect of what you've researched and what you work with elite performers. Just finally, what's the kind of future? You've hinted at some sort of technological developments, but what's the kind of some of the key questions that you'd love to unpick in the future?
Kind of key area we're going as a group at the moment is into the data science area. So we've just enrolled 6 new PhD students in that data space, very much trying to give sports and trying to enhance our understanding of the kind of the data strategy a sport has. So lots of sports have all these data sources coming in. Most of them in isolation, and very few sports have what I class as a data strategy. I'm not a data scientist, but for me, very simply, a data strategy is you've got all your inputs coming in, whether it's GPS, heart rate, performance analysis data. You then have to have obviously a filtering, cleaning process, or a process to check the quality of that data. It then goes into a data analysis type area where you're trying to get the data to make sense, talk to each other. And then at the end point, you've got a data visualization and key messages coming out. So we've just taken on a number of PhD students in different sports, swimming, rugby, football, cycling, who are all going to start trying to come up with this data strategy and ultimately try and utilize data to inform practitioners and coaches better. And that's the big area we're going into as a group, because most technologies that are being developed now is generating data. It's brilliant. It's great to have all this data, but it's really important you can actually utilize and action off the back of that data. And that's something that sport and exercise science, I don't think, has done brilliantly over the years, especially not when you're talking about lots of different sources of data. A lot of time it can be conflicting. GPS is saying this, performance analysis is saying that, and sometimes you just pick one and run with it. It might be the wrong one you've picked. So using the more advanced data analytics skills, in other areas, in your computer science, your medical physics, all these sorts of areas, I think will really help us understand what that data is actually telling us and what can we action off the back of that data.
Yeah. Fascinating. Interesting that you're taking that direction too. I mean, you've got lovely breadth in your research profile. That's something I would value, because you've got, as an applied practitioner, you have breadth. You need to have breadth. You need to have that direction. But interesting you're taking that. And I would imagine in the future, because ultimately that comes down to better individualization rather than just group norms and group think.
Exactly.
Hey, fascinating to chat to you, Liam. Thanks so much for popping on and sharing your insights. Really, really appreciate the conversation.
Thanks, Steve. Absolute pleasure.
Hope you enjoyed today's conversation. If you did, please take a chance to press like and subscribe to the channel. And for audio, please do leave a review. Thank you.